Okay, but we're going to get into our panel presentation. Chris, you can go ahead and get back on. I know you're running our last segment, which is our predictions panel for what to expect for 2023. And Chris, are you on?
I'm on. Yep.
Okay,
that was a great conversation. I listening in, I love hearing the teacher's perspective because that's where the rubber is hitting the road. And for teachers to also hear in the context of this forum, it's great for people to listen to districts, to listen to people like St. Vrain and Meridian and Goldendale and all the other rock star districts that we've been highlighting today, to actually hear from teachers who are themselves rock stars is really good for folks to hear, because we need to hear that there are successes at the classroom level and on the street and in the schools with the kids, and that all of the things that we're talking about that we listen to Cale Charles, and we're about to listen to some other very highly esteemed professionals in the business about how to do things and how the successes they've had and movements and frameworks and all the other vocabulary that goes along with transformation. But we very seldom hear from folks that are with the kids, that are one-to-one with the kids, elbow to elbow, knee to knee, and for me that's really valuable. I applaud the teachers that are with us today, especially the ones that are award winners, because none of this stuff happens without you.
Yeah,
truthfully, it just doesn't.
Felicia didn't say this when she was on from Permissions to Succeed, but she has seen astronomical increase in achievement with her kids applying hybrid logistics and courseware, right? So she's just seen it take off. And I know Howard Stevenson will comment on this as well. But before I jump off and let you run your panel, I just want to make sure that I give these predictions from a Learning Council perspective from the research. And that is, we are expecting 2023 to be another record spend year, particularly on digital curriculum. But we're also expecting 2023 to be the increasing heavy pressure on traditional public to change, and not change in a mild way. So we're hoping they heard everything that we said, and that they're really thinking about the two biggest pressure points, which we believe are that time and space thing, and that we're even trying to help solve. So with that said, those are my predictions, and I've said other ones earlier today, and I'll leave it over to you and your illustrious panel of super awesome people, and
Absolutely.
I'll go to that slide for you.
Yeah, I think we're just missing one person. Andrew Kim is our third panelist today, but I'm gonna sort of riff off of something that you said about time and space. It's interesting to me to listen to all of the people that are talking about time and space shifts, and that's something that's relatively new. And it's interesting for me to step on the outside of all of this, knowing that that's been the conversation. We've been having this conversation for some time, but now it's becoming more common vocabulary. And that's another indicator of change. It's another indicator, it's evidence that things are shifting and changing. And I said this before earlier at the top of the day, that we can see it. This is a moment of hope and celebration, because we can see movement. Those of you in the schools, it's hard to see it because you're causing it to happen. And sometimes it's difficult to look in and say, wow, look where we came from. Look how far we've come. But it's important to give yourself that grace and that acknowledgement, because you have come a long way. I mean, it's remarkable how far we've come in a very short period of time. And that's very exciting to me as we start to think about where we're going.
I just want to say hi to, before I turn off my camera, I want to say hi to Anthony from my home state where I grew up in Minnesota, Bemidji, Minnesota. So hey to Minnesota. Nice. And my longtime friend Howard, who I could talk to for hours, and I know your stories are going to be great, Senator Howard Stevenson. So you guys go. Thank you so much. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm gonna make some quick introductions, at the very least, something brief, and then I'm going to ask each of you to sort of give a little bit of information about yourself while Andrew gets on the call. Senator Howard Stevenson's with us from Utah. He's been leading a lot of work, and he's sort of sort of a maven in getting a lot of this type of conversation going. It's not a new conversation for him. He has done a lot of this work and has brought a lot of stuff forward. I'm going to stop there, and Senator, I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm a recovering state senator for 26 years in the Utah Senate, and now working to continue the vision of personalized learning for every child. In my undergraduate work a half a century ago, I studied the science of learning, the psychology of learning, and learned a lot about Piaget and Bloom and their claim that is often overlooked, that anybody can be proficient in math and reading if they get immediate interactive feedback while doing the work. And of course, in their day, that can only be provided by tutors. But today we have virtual tutors who can do the heavy lifting of personalized learning. And so we have had several things in the Utah legislature to assist our local school districts to move into the 21st century with digital teaching and learning. One of the first of those was our Upstart program for 4-year-olds in the home, getting 15 minutes a day of instruction to prepare them for kindergarten. And we've now had multiple years of third-party evaluations showing that these kids, low-income, minority, special ed, and English learners, start kindergarten on average at a first grade level in reading and math. And there's never been anything like it in the history of early learning. Ted Global gave us an award for that, saying that this is one of 8 audacious ideas that can change the world. We also had reading software and math software that I can talk more about later that has made a difference in helping Utah be the leader in having the lowest decline in growth, student growth during COVID, and according to the NAEP National Report Card.
Yeah, that's great, and it's good for me to highlight also that as you've been listening, we've got a good number of Utah award recipients, and that's interesting to me because a lot of that is again evidence of shifts that have been made in mindset and in this particular case in policy that are beginning to trickle down or have already and are being seen as evidence of progress and of innovation, and that's fascinating. We're going to get into that a little bit more as we get through our time together. Anthony, it's great to see you always. If you have half the snow that we've got up here in northern Wisconsin, then you're in for a cold night tonight. But I don't know. I don't know what your weather looks like down there.
Yeah, I think they're saying about 30 below with the wind chill tonight.
Nice.
But then there's definitely warmer weather on the way. So I'm looking at that in the days to come.
Yeah, if you could just introduce yourself a little bit about what you do for to make magic happen where you are.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate being here this afternoon. I'm Anthony Paternis, the Executive Director of Technology for Osseo Area Schools, and I've had the pleasure of serving this school district for just over 5 years now. In Minnesota context, we're the 5th largest school district in the state of Minnesota. We have approximately 21,000 students, serving about a 40% white population and a 60% BIPOC student population, with a great diversity of free and reduced price lunch at about 40% of our population, a large multi-language learner population, and a sizable special ed population. And we cover 7 different communities kind of in the northwest suburbs of the Minneapolis, St. Paul metropolitan area. Prior to coming to Osseo Area Schools, I've been with a variety of other school districts, but at heart, I'm a recovering high school mathematics teacher. So the core is in my classroom from my upbringings, and it's been a great journey being coming into this space around digital learning and technology and how our systems can be transformed, utilizing and enhancing the power that technology brings us in the education space.
Yeah, that's great. And so it's interesting that you're you're sort of walking that line between tech and teaching at this point. And it's fascinating to me to meet and talk to people who are walking that line, because as we heard earlier in the day, there's a good number of folks that are still struggling with the combination of those two things. And as both of you can attest to, unless those two halves of the same circle are operating together, it kind of doesn't work out, right? I mean, that's just Anthony, you've seen some stuff like that, right?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we watch out for, and it's one of those things that if you were going to pick one thing to do, that's a great one to tackle, because it's foundational to some of the other successes that we see. So I'm going to sort of give us some context, and this particular conversation is interesting to me because this is where we get to use a crystal ball. And I mentioned earlier in the day, we looked at the data that Lonnie was sharing from the survey. And what strikes me is what's between the lines of information. And I'm always very curious about what the story that the data is, and what is the story telling us, and what questions can we ask of the data that inform us in how we move forward. And that's not brand new in data use or information use, but what I'm intrigued by is what story that tells about teaching and learning. And so what I see is that, and what we've been watching is this progression or an evolution or development, and we're watching people moving forward at what is now a relatively predictive sort of a rate. And what we're facing right now is, in the past, a lot of the schools and school systems had that were starting this work, St. Vrain being one of them, Meriden being another of them. They started this work, and they went through certain steps as they went along. And as they got a little bit more sophisticated and learned lessons and failed forward, we watched what happened. Those were documented. And what's curious now is that following the pandemic and moving into the pandemic, school systems just bought a bunch of stuff, which was kind of where those guys were way back when, 10, 15 years ago. They just bought a bunch of stuff, and they may or may not have had a great plan, but they tossed it out into the wild. And then they're like, well, now what do we do? Well, let's see what's working, what's not. And they went through all these sort of processes. What's magical now is that that's happening en masse right now. And virtually every school was shoved into that beginning step. And now, oddly enough, they're following a very predictable pattern. And so what's interesting is that we, as advocates for support for these systems, have the interesting job of supporting virtually everybody who wasn't already there. And that's a bunch of work. It also highlights for me the necessity of partnership in the thing that we're doing, which is why you all are here, because you're my partners in crime. And as we know, we don't go down the path together. This is only going to succeed if we can do this hand in hand. So I've got some questions. This panel is going to be about predictions. It's going to be using the crystal ball. What do we see in the future? I'm going to ask us, and I have some specific questions about looking into the recent past as a lens for seeing how we move forward. And there's going to be things that come out of our conversation that I might toss at you that may not have been planned, just because we riff off of each other. And this is a really informal conversation. So my first question is this, and I know that each of you has a different lens, and Andrew Kim, when he joins the conversation, has a slightly different lens as well. He's at the University of Texas. And the reason that you three are all here is because you do hold a different lens. And that's fascinating to me. So the question is this, from your lens, what do you see as lessons learned and successes leading up to, through, and on the other side of the pandemic? What were some of those lessons learned? And Senator Stevenson, I'm going to start with you. You started to allude to some of that, and you and I have had conversations in the past about some interesting outcomes that may not have been foreseen. But what was it that you saw that led up to, through, and on the other side of that pandemic experience. What do you think?
Yeah, more than a decade before the pandemic, Utah legislature had put out there tens of thousands of licenses for early reading software to give teachers the capacity to let the machine do the personalization of learning and adapt to the child's where they are and to move them forward as quickly as they're able, and for that teacher to take the reports from the software to provide one-on-one and small group instruction to intervene when the software is not perfect. And we did that more than 10 years ago, and we've had teachers. The struggle was getting teachers to trust the machine to do the heavy lifting of personalized instruction that a teacher simply cannot do with 28 kids. And we have that size of classrooms in Utah. A few years after that, we had math software, 200,000 licenses of math software through our STEM Action Center to give kids the immediate feedback. Rather than kids going home and crying over their math homework, they were now getting intervention with high quality software to interrupt them mid-problem. If they're solving a polynomial, for example, and they get the order of operations wrong, they're interrupted and taught that. So in the moment of making the mistake, they get corrected in their mistake. And by virtue of finishing their homework, they got 100%. And by virtue of getting 100% on their homework and learning as they made mistakes, which are always desirable if you get intervention in the moment of the mistake, we saw our math scores increase drastically, especially for those kids most at risk. So those two programs, the reading software and the math software, when used with fidelity by teachers, made a huge difference. And then about 4 years before the pandemic, the Utah legislature, in conjunction with the State Board of Education, created the nation's first statewide digital teaching and learning master plan, where entire schools opted in to the elements of the master plan and made sure that teachers had the PD necessary to use the tools in the master plan effectively. And so that happened all before COVID. So when COVID hit, rather than just relying on Zoom meetings, which we all know were just disastrous in most cases, these kids still had a half hour a day of reading software and a half hour a day on their math software. So they didn't have the kinds of losses that were rampant around the nation as people were struggling, wondering, what do we do? Well, we had the time on the software already ingrained in with many of our classrooms. And it's believed that that's why the NAEP national report card showed that Utah had among the lowest, and on some, the very lowest learning losses in the entire nation. And we feel it's because we did the work before that. And now we're learning to perfect it even better now that we have seen what trusting the software to do the heavy lifting of personalized learning can do for teachers. I've always said that teachers are working too hard. They really are. They're struggling. They're working too hard. Just like accountants had electronic spreadsheets ease their burden, just like engineers have had CAD systems do things that it used to take them 3 months to do, now takes them 3 minutes to enter the specs. Similarly, teachers can trust the machine to do the heavy lifting of what used to be very laborious and very ineffective because you just couldn't reach every kid. Now you can.
Yeah, and that's great. And it sort of harkens back to a conversation we had earlier in the day about design and being planful. And it's not an accident that you ended up with some outcomes as you're describing, because you actually had a plan in mind. You set the plan forward. The plan started moving as it was designed to, and the outcomes were as you would have expected them. I'm going to pause for just a moment because Andy Kim, my good friend and respected colleague, just joined us today. Andy, give yourself a quick intro, and I'll give you some background on what we're talking about here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I was a former superintendent of schools here in Texas, in the great state of Texas, and so once again, really appreciate the partnership that we've had in the past, and certainly this event as well too. And I retired, and since then I'm with the University of Texas at Austin with an institute, the Texas Behavioral Science and Policy Institute, where we work with Dr. David Yeager and also Carol Dweck out of Stanford University. And so we're working on this notion of how we can connect sort of the engagement with not only teachers along with each other, but with students as well too. So I think COVID, it's not that COVID eradicated math formulas, even though maybe many of the students probably want that to have occurred. I think the question becomes, how do we get teachers, adults, and students re-engaged in the learning process? And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to re-engage about relationships are important, but really who's giving us the science behind how to make that engagement and relationship really work. And so our institute is in charge of working with school districts to really look at the latest research, scientific research and evidence on behavioral science, and really talk with administrators and adults about how to make that work. And what we've seen, of course, is positive results when it comes to teacher retention as a result of having ownership of that process, but also engagement of students back in, especially in the areas of mathematics, because of the fact that they feel like they have ownership in the process. And so I think that's a big part of what we do. And so certainly I think it really made me think about some of the comments that was made earlier about the process related to all the apps that are out there. And as the senator mentioned just now about how it's important to really scaffold some of these new tools that we have, or else it just is too much sometimes. And I think that's what the teachers are feeling there. And so once again, I just appreciate the opportunity to kind of make some few comments.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we're going to come back to you. I think it's interesting that we're talking about behaviors. I had a conversation with a colleague very recently, in fact, 2 days ago, about shifts that had occurred, and this one in particular was about class size, and we were talking about how this certain school that we were examining had tiny classes, and yet the results that they were seeing in terms of engagement, in terms of learning, didn't match up. And I was saying, good Lord, you should be killing it. We should be off the charts, because I could potentially have an IEP for every kid, and I could be one-to-one with every kid in that classroom. And what we see is that even with that declining number, if you go from a large number to a small number, or whatever the progression is, if the practice doesn't change, then the results don't match up, and then the small class size has no bearing on that, on anything. There's a reason why it's a 0.21 from Hattie, and it's because the practice doesn't change along with it. So I'll shut up for now. Anthony, what do you think? Lessons learned leading up to, through, and on the other side of within reason pandemic land?
Yeah, I think, districts are in a really interesting space coming out of the pandemic and out of a lot of conversations that we've, had throughout the day-to-day, and as mentioned by my colleagues who are on here. And, as I've spoken to a few groups, we came through the pandemic, and for a lot of teachers and school districts, it was, I call it digital learning immersion for teachers. So we've had a lot of education organizations that have had one-to-one programs, but, the adoption of what that looks like in school districts was wide variability, and teachers engaged at different levels. And the pandemic really put them in a space where they had to lean into that, where they might not have had to historically in the past. And so, what I see with school districts and colleagues that I talk with is kind of this grappling of where are we going, and what does this mean, and really how do we harness the power of technology, but also how can we learn from, what are the lessons learned from, previous organizations like ASIO, where we've had a digital learning program and one-to-one in place years prior to the pandemic, where teachers were kind of set in a good space. And, I think Chris, you've mentioned some good things and a lot of others. And where I always encourage a lot of caution is the technology and the tools and the software can hold front and center. And in the evolution of what I see with school districts, it's often the technology and the software are leading the conversation, and trying to get systems back to what is the purpose of our education institution? What are we trying to create? And what is the role of the teacher? And getting back to what is that teaching and learning structure? And then how do we utilize the tools and the resources that we have in our system to align and scaffold appropriately to actually achieve and accomplish what we want to get to in our system? In Osseo, we were very intentional before the pandemic, when we started leading our digital learning, of not having any reference to technology in there. It was about creating learning processes to develop an environment for path, pace, and place for students. And all of those definitions, none of them had reference to technology. You could create those environments with or without technology. Technology allows greater efficiency and opportunity to really expand on those. And then we were able to bring in that conversation around what technology is really going to amplify that and get us to the personalized learning environment that we want to achieve.
Nice. And what I hear over and over again from actually all three of you and everybody else who's sharing today is intention. And so, this whole day, except for a very brief window, has not at all been about technology. It just hasn't. Technology, yes, it's helping to facilitate a lot of the things that we want to be able to accomplish. But what I hear from folks that are sharing, yourselves included, is that Andy, sort of like coming from your current place, the behaviors and the practice that had to shift and change in order to leverage the technology to amplify the learning. And that's sort of, Senator Stevenson, that's kind of the message that your programming helped to accomplish. And I think you and I have talked a couple of times about incentive and being able to set up, to help people to get over that hump so that they can say, okay, yes, I'm going to focus on practice. I now have incentive to change my practice and then go do something new. Where have you all seen that incentive used to positive effect in order to change practice? Where have you all seen that?
We have basically enabled LEAs to accomplish the transition from just a bricks and mortar Sage on the Stage classroom through multiple incentives. We have given software funded at the state level and implemented by our State Department of Ed, and giving support to all of the LEAs so that their instructional leaders can know how to give the PD. So we provide money for that. The same thing with math software. For us, as Anthony said, it's not about the device. In fact, if we make it about the device, it can be a distraction to learning. And we've seen that in a lot of different instances where flooding a district with one-to-one devices actually reduces student outcomes. And I saw a vendor who had a tool to see in minute increments where the devices were. And I looked at one school district that had one-to-one iPads, and we had to scroll down 3 screens before we could find anything that students were engaged in that were assigned to their teachers. The rest of it was mostly social media and games and that kind of thing that had nothing to do with a student learning. And so our incentives have been focused on giving the teachers the PD they need to know how to use software on a device with fidelity. And for us, we're focusing on reading and math mostly because we learn to read till 3rd grade, and then we read to learn. The same thing with math. If you don't have math, the other sciences are going to be a struggle for you. And so we've really focused on helping the teachers have the PD they need to use the math and reading software that have been certified by the State Department of Ed and their research. We also build into that a third-party evaluation so that we can tell which tools are working most effectively. And that way, these schools can opt into a more effective tool when they see that theirs isn't working well. So in Utah, the legislature has done a lot to provide the software funding and the PD funding and the first statewide digital teaching and learning master plan that schools opt into. Nothing is mandated. And that's really important. They have to have ownership in those choices. But it has had an incredible effect on student outcomes and student improvement. As Andrew said earlier, with Carol Dweck's work in mindset, we've also focused on Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole's work, PEAK, the book PEAK, which has extensive research on the science of expertise and basically focusing on deliberate practice, the idea that you practice in a deliberate way rather than just in a general way, and that you get immediate feedback with each attempt. That's the real secret we have found, is getting that feedback and then having the software that's adaptive to the student's rate of improvement. And it's just been amazing to see that the original work done by Piaget and Bloom have been validated by Carol Dweck and Anders Ericsson.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating to me. That it's fascinating that we are this far down the path, and all of a sudden, again, we're saying, oh, wait a minute, Piaget, that's some brilliant stuff. Wait, should we try some of that? Hey, yeah, let's do it. I see, Andy, I see you nodding your head, and I know that you've got a connection to the research on this one. What do you think about that the idea of incentivizing in the context of behavior shift and change? And you've done a lot of the great work in Comal as well, and so how do you see that? How do you see those changes and shifts relative to how we get those people moving forward? And maybe there is an incentive of some kind. It's not always monetary, right? Sometimes it's something else.
Yeah, I think the senator is pointing out a sort of a human nature, which is somewhat, seems very commonsensical, very hard to do. When we, Chris, as you're familiar, I helped to design and create the Maynard NewTek High School here in Texas as well, some time ago, and part of the NewTek network work as well, and certainly expanded that in Comal Independent School District, where I was superintendent for the last 10 years. One of the things that we found out through that work was that when kids, especially with those even with prior behavior issues or disengagement issues, when you started concentrating on great learning, great engagement, that became almost zero. And we had to really think about, do we treat the symptom or do we treat causes and root issues? And I think for an opportune time here coming out of COVID, and it was mentioned earlier that certainly COVID has given a look-see into how education really works. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to design and redesign and certainly think about the research that's out there and really connect to that. And, I will say that just from my own experience, connecting to some of the research, and as Senator points out, and I'm sure Anthony can point out as well too, sometimes we distance ourselves from it because of the fact that, it's too busy. It's really hard to get to. It's not readily available. And I think we have to sort of close that gap in many ways in order to make that work. And I think incentives about the learning in itself, and Chris, I think you're pointing this out, where's the market dollars in terms of a financial gain? I mean, that's going to be a challenge for all school districts out there from a school finance perspective.
Sure.
but we could potentially utilize time and space, and that to be the greatest sort of incentive by utilizing technology, but also how do we connect with people in a better way? Because I think technology, as we talked about in Maynard UTech and UTech schools in the past that I've talked about, is that really these devices are, I'm sure Anthony would agree, is really an invisible tool. And as a result of that, we really need to put that aside and really think about the processes of human connection, interaction that we need to really forge ahead. And so I think that's going to be the most important incentive for people. And that, I think that's what teachers are asking for. How do I re-engage? How do I re-engage with myself, with my colleagues, with administration, with kids? We all know so much more.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating to think about re-engagement, because I think that if I think back to years before the pandemic, we're blaming a lot of the disengagement on the pandemic, but I think it was happening before. I think we had started this disengagement with effective practice and with humanity and relationship sometime before, and I used the rise of SEL as a focus, as an evidence point, because the fact that we actually had to start focusing very explicitly on something that seemed very human is odd to me. That indicates that there's something up. Anthony, what are your thoughts on that whole conversation?
Yeah, I think engagement plays a huge role, and I'm just, as I'm kind of briefly processing and reflecting on this and thinking about, engagement seems to, or disengagement seems to have amplified coming out of the pandemic. But Chris, I think you're right. Disengagement was already there, and it got amplified coming out because students, got a new experience and a way of being and interacting, during that pandemic time. And we came back and we really kind of blamed that students don't know the systems and structures of school. So, to me, that goes back to it's not as much of an engagement issue or disengagement issue as it is a structure of school, and structurally how we've built things in a traditional model that we're trying to force students back into that box. And we are really in a good opportunity to re-examine that. What are the systems and structures that are in place? And instead of blaming it on the existing systems and structures, why are students not engaged? And how do we redesign and rethink the opportunities for the learning process and get to the core and the heart of amplifying the learning process and design around that?
There's this thing called inquiry. It might be new. There's creativity and collaboration, critical thinking. Those are all brand new. We're going to be talking about that next year. That's not for this year. It's awesome to me to think about people considering engagement still. And if you think of the most highly crafted learning experience, every rock star teacher that I've ever had the pleasure to be near rolls that stuff. It's built in, and they grab kids by the heart, and that's awesome. But it's not new. It's not brand new. And those guys have been doing it forever. And yet somehow now this is a brand new conversation. And maybe it's just iterative, right? Maybe it's just something that we have to maintain as a high profile focus. And for those of us who have been doing this for many years, like we all have, sometimes I sit back and go, this again? We're doing this one again. Are we? I thought we learned that one, guys. But it's true. It's true. We have to keep that focused. I'm going to move us along. I have another question here, and it's relative to current situations that we are now finding ourselves in. And it's sort of relative to a lot of the pressures that we've been talking about. And so we've got societal pressures, and we've got political pressures that are pressing down and smushing on education as a business as a whole, and it encompasses public ed, it encompasses anything relative to the transition through charter to private, and it's causing some things. It's causing some changes and shifts, and I'm wondering, what I'd like to know from you, from each of your lenses, is how are those pressures shaping what we know as education, teaching and learning today, and what do you see happening today, given the stuff that's going on in the news? And it's all over the news, right? I mean, we've got folks passing legislation around choice and voucher and all the other things, and there's funding wars and there's all kinds of stuff going on. How is that affecting what we know as teaching and learning? I'm going to start with you, Senator Stevenson, because I said the word legislation.
Well, the Utah legislature just passed this year a comprehensive education savings account, together with a huge pay raise for teachers, all in the same bill. But it has really upset the public education system and their school boards and that kind of thing, who universally have opposed it. And so right now we're looking at trying to get all the parties back together, looking forward, as opposed to having this angst from the education community about what the legislature has done to create more options for school choice. We have widespread charter schools already in Utah. About 11% of our kids in Utah are in charters. Since the pandemic, we've had a flee from the public schools to homeschools and other kinds of things because people were disturbed by what they didn't see happening during those virtual classrooms. And so I'm proposing to our legislature to do what I did as chair of education when I was in the legislature, and that was organize a P20 summit every other year in a location where we're away from all distractions. We can all get at the same table. We have people in these round tables from all the different governance units in the P20 spectrum, and legislators and legislative leaders and on the education committees, all working together toward what is our next goal. We want to get past the current impasse that we're experiencing in this state, because it really had a negative effect on the mood toward policymakers. And so we're working at trying to get them together in a way that actually, as we were doing it when I was in the legislature, that's what led to our competency-based learning efforts. That's what led to our digital teaching and learning statewide program. That's what led to other kinds of structural changes in our school systems that led to greater student outcomes. So, and then of course there's the critical race theory and the other kinds of things that people are talking about, gender fluidity. That all is entering into the school board protests that come about. And that's true in Utah as well as other states, that we have these kinds of things, and some of them are just based on conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. But we need to be inclusive in letting everybody know that they've been heard, and then giving the right information back to them. We've also had some people who say, I don't want my child to ever see a computer in their classroom because computers are bad and screen time is bad. And I'll agree, we have probably way too much screen time for our youth, and we ought to limit that. And that's why we don't necessarily support the notion of one-to-one devices. We support the notion of one-to-one student engagement on high-quality software for certain periods of the day.
I think it's interesting because that's what we're talking about also in that commentary is community. Private schools aren't new. We've had those, and we're relatively symbiotic, right? We can't ignore the fact that we all live within a community, and yeah, we do have to talk to each other, and we have to sit down at a table together. And if we don't, that starts the downward spiral, I think. And that's, and the question is about impact and from pressure, and that has an impact. the fact that we're not getting along, the fact that we're not listening to all voices, that does have an impact on education in general. No matter where you land, it has an impact. And guess who the impact affects? Not the adults. It actually impacts the kids, and that it impacts them as adults as they move forward into the system, into the workplace. So, Andrew, Anthony, what do you think? How do you see pressures affecting education? Anthony, you're on.
Yeah.
There you go.
I love the idea that Senator Stevens mentioned around a P20 summit and getting all the voices in the room. And, it makes me think that, this fall I was having a conversation with a group of Minnesota superintendents around legislative policy as we were getting ready for our legislative session and what that means for education. And, we kind of got into a rich conversation about we're still working on trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. And we've got a lot of great conversations around how can we be more flexible and personal, but we're really still trying to manipulate a structure and a system that was designed in the industrial era for developing students for that economic times and what the economy needs. And, our country, our economy has evolved, and we really need something different. And so, we weren't able to answer this, but it really needs to get into some conversations of what is the purpose of education and the education system, and how or what do we need students to be able to do to be productive in our society, to be productive in our economy, and then really think about how do we structure and design education around that. And I think, that question of what is the purpose of education gets to the key of a lot of the challenges that we're seeing right now, and the desire for choice, or looking at different systems to find different structures that might better meet the needs of what, the community is seeing that they need for their scholars to be successful. And so that's, I think, something where individual school systems are wrestling with as we're trying to adapt and modify. But, on the larger scale, there's some system structures in state law and federal law that, sometimes prohibit and inhibit us from really getting to that innovative state to take it to the next level. But we really need to come together and have a conversation about where are we going with education, and what is the next generation of what we want our system to be.
Right. Well said. Andy, what do you think?
As a superintendent of schools, I will tell you that my community and my parents, they wanted the very best, and I think we can all agree on that, for their children. And I think that there is a desire of options to look at multiple different options. And I think that an important concept for us to think about when we consider our customers. And so I think we have to be very thoughtful about that. And our customers are our students and our parents. We exist on their behalf. And so, and Anthony is right, we're dealing with an infrastructural system that does not have R&D dollars, right? We may be one of the very few, if not the only industry where R&D is not spoken on a regular basis. And every dollar that we have goes to fund what we got going on, mainly personnel, teachers. And so with 85%, close to 85% of all budgets dealing with staffing. So I think when you think about this issue about how can we innovate, we have to be thoughtful. And I think school districts are wanting to innovate, wanting to deliver the very best product and services to their community. And it just really is a very difficult task when we are dealing with infrastructure that was built that serves perhaps some time ago, and things have changed. And if you look at the numbers, especially in the survey information that you presented earlier this morning, I was really surprised, but not really, about all these micro schools that are coming up throughout our state and throughout our country. And these are fast moving, very adaptable schools that are coming up. And I think that, we ought to take a look at those. So is there a way within that, as the senator mentioned, in a P20 council, P20 committee, looking at where are the R&Ds? Where can we adopt? Where can we make some adjustments. And I'm talking about things like master schedules. I'm talking about assessments. I'm talking about how do we use time better? How do we go about making sure that not all kids need to be there from 8 to 3 o'clock lockstep, perhaps? I think kids don't want to be there all day like that. Parents don't want them to be there all that way. There are many school districts in the state of Texas right now experimenting with 4-day week schedules with either a Friday or Monday being off. So I think there are a lot of things happening. It would be kind of nice to look at all those things to say what are the innovation? What are the R&D? What can we do to really scale these things up? And how can we do that in a systematic way at the state level?
Those are the kinds of questions, if I might, that we need to address at this P20 summit that I hope they will reconvene. I wanted to ask you, Director Kim, about Texas Commission on Virtual Education. That was created 2 years ago in 2021 legislation. And for 2 years, they've been meeting and gave their final report in December. It's very similar to Utah's Digital Teaching and Learning Master Plan effort. And I was really encouraged by that as I was asked to testify before the commission last summer. And I was so impressed with the intelligence of that commission, their diversity, and the way they were working together to drill down into how can we further Texas virtual education. Do you have any comments on that? Because I would recommend that to all of the people who are engaged with this group to look at that final report that was issued in December. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Senator, the chair of that committee is a great friend of mine, and we served together on the SBEC, the State Board of Educator Certification. And I know that one of the things I think that Texas had an advantage was that some time ago, we had a lot of discussion on blended learning processes. And I'm sure you're familiar with that. I think Anthony is very familiar with blended learning concepts. We have schools known as PTEX, NUTEX, of course, and variety of platforms that were trying to utilize technology as well as digitized learning tools to make that work. So I think that this became a culminating effect, but they also researched best practices elsewhere. And as you mentioned, the Lieutenant Governor's Office and the Governor's Office did a great job of convening one of the top group of people to really look at this to make the recommendation. I hope that the legislature, which is currently in session, will not only take those points, but also to execute that and to figure out a way to make those things a standard and to actually resource those things in order to make that happen. I think that's going to be the critical factor, that the timing of this is interesting, that it doesn't get shelved, that we do visit that and it gets done, even though there's competing needs right now with teacher pay issues and different things, as you mentioned, that this does not get overlooked. And that's a great question that you're bringing up.
Yeah, this is fantastic, and I love that we've gone down this path because we do have a need to convene, and what we're talking about in terms of R&D, we actually see that, and so what I have the ability to do and the great fortune to do is look across a landscape and see those bright spots pop up. And we've got a number of them here, and Osseo and Kamala are two of them. But a place like St. Vrain, a place like Osseo, a place like Kamal, a place like Meriden, any of the others, Goldendale, those folks are R&Ding. They're doing it in the context of the thing. It's just that at some point, where do we collect all of that, and what do we do with it all? I had a conversation with a colleague yesterday afternoon, and we were talking about this, and we're like, well, you know what? There are bright spots. There's these people over here and these people over here. They're doing great things. They've got a great model. They've been doing it for a long time. They can show that their efforts are having an effect. And yet, how do we get that up out of the swamp? and push that over the top and be able to show people what it looks like so that they can follow and then provide the supports. And I think you're right. I think it's going to have to come from another level. I think the organization is going to have to listen and learn, and then help support from a more meaningful way versus an unfunded mandate. We know how that fun stuff goes. So that's fascinating to me. Anthony, do you have any thoughts on that stuff before I jump in?
You know, as you're mentioning that, it'd be great to have that collective of R&D. I mean, we see it within our individual states. We've got, good conversation amongst, our colleagues, and it's pretty common from state to state that states know what's going on within their own state between their colleagues. But the unique thing is when we can start to see what's happening across our country and how we can start to blend that together from a school district side, but also, what I would say from a leadership perspective in school, kind of understanding what are the conditions that exist at a, state legislature level that helps to aid in the environment and the conditions that allow for a district to get to that R&D process. So, we've got a lot of innovative school districts in Minnesota that are really trying to push the bounds, but we end up hitting against a state statute around we have to have so many seat hours where a student is physically in the building, sitting in a seat in a classroom. That starts to inhibit some of the creativity where we would like to take and run with that. So how, starting to have from state to state conversations of what have you done to help, provide the conditions that allow school districts to get to a better R&D place and a better space of innovation that's not inhibiting them within their environments and really excelling us as a whole country.
I like the idea of creativity, and Andy, I'm going to come back to you because the notion of creative constraint, as an advertising guy, we use that all the time. And so I'm a former ad man. I was on creative side in agencies. And what was happening then is if we needed the best ideas, of course you bring the creative team together and you give them a brief and you set up the bumpers. This is the parameter. Here's the box. And I'm going to flip this back over to you, Andy, in just a minute. But here's the box. You have the best ideas come out of that box. And here's your constraint. Ready, go. And magic popped out. Magic occurred. And the best creative concepts came out of the fact that they were constrained. And Andy, I credit you with that because we had a conversation about in the box thinking, and that's something that I think has merit here.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for that. I think that if you talk to superintendents, branding has becoming and marketing for that matter, has become a significant area of work that school districts are going to have to get on board with. If you think about it, we, as a public school system, we never had to do that. We had a ready-made client-based customers, whether they liked it or not, or we liked it or not. And so now we're in a situation where we had to really, make sure our product, our services is great. But then again, we also had to compete and to be able to share the value that we bring to the table. And I think that narrative, that storyline of delivering that value when parents are probably shopping for schools today is an important caveat to the work that needs to be done now. And, Chris, you and I talked about the fact that schools are not built this way. This is not a fundamental, strength of thinking this way. And I think it's beyond just putting out social media content. It's really about thinking about your value system and what value do you bring and how do you create the alignment of that value to your community and perhaps others to be able to draw in folks to say, let's engage in that. And I think that's going to be the perplexing conversations that school leaders are going to have within their organizations.
I'm working with a small school right now. They lost about 50% of their FTE to a neighboring school. At the same time, there are high school students receiving letters from other neighboring schools of recruitment. And I'm like, guys, guess what? It's gloves off. Let's do this. It's time to engage the marketing machine. And that's absolutely right. And they have to do it, because if they don't, it's a downhill slide. And we have to engage the marketing conversation. We can't help it. Absolutely. So that's fantastic. We can go all kinds. Andy, that's going to be another Horizon Room topic. That one's coming back in season 2, because I think we need to dig into that a little bit more, for sure. So my closing question, and we're sort of running out of time, but I'm going to ask you to use your crystal ball again. And what do you see as the near and long-term evolution of education? And I'm going to broaden it just a little bit, K-12 and post-secondary, because they're inextricable right now. And what we have to do is consider both, because post-secondary not only affects the end of the 12, but it affects the process of K-12 through teacher preparation and principal school, and superintendent school. So thinking in that lens, what are the near and long-term evolutions that you see coming for teaching and learning and education as a whole? And Howard, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think there's going to be a divergence between those who want to stick to traditional education and those who are willing to trust new technologies to teach our children better. And I've seen that in teaching colleges. I've seen it in schools. And of course, you have different parents advocating for one or the other. And I think you're going to see some divergence there, where I don't think there should be, because we ought to follow the science. We ought to follow the data. And that's why in Utah, we have always had a third-party independent evaluator of all of these kinds of digital teaching and learning programs, so that we can pull the plug if the funding isn't making a difference, or we can enhance it. We can find out what works with how different LEAs have engaged in those things. But one of my biggest concerns is that we may get people looking at the technology for technology's sake, or the new instructional model for its own sake. For example, we're all familiar with High Tech High, which focuses kids on a project that they need to get done by the end of the year. And the latest I looked, their California statewide scores in math, for example, were not that great. And even though the math may have been good for that one student in developing that clock out of wood and having to gauge the different gears in the clock, but the broader learning of math was lost. And I think we need to be careful about how we look at all of those innovative, as Lalani says, shiny new objects, and really look at the data and then follow the data toward the solutions we need. You know, we know that Bloom's taxonomy, the base of that is academic skills and content knowledge. And that's where our national report card and our PISA scores are not that great in just basic math and literacy knowledge. We have the tools today to give teachers the ability to give personalized instruction in both of those areas for every child. And that's what I'm hoping the future will hold, and that people will know that when you do that, when you create that solid foundation, then the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, such as synthesis, evaluation, inquiry, and creativity and collaboration, you can focus on those better because they have that base. Without the base, it's a struggle to get the rest.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that goes along with a lot of other things tied to this, including teaching practice. If you don't have a firm foundation, and that goes along to things like a curriculum map. If you don't have a curriculum map, it's going to be really hard to flex. You just don't. You're standing on sand. The floor is not firm. Anthony, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, kind of in the near term, we're going to continue to see the evolution of, I'm going to call them personalized pathways. We've been having a lot of conversation in our system around, what does that look like from a secondary pathway? If a student has a passion around computer science or engineering, how can we help build upon that interest to get them the math, the reading skills within that interest space that connects them and engages them in the learning aspects to foundationally get them where they want to be and set them up, for future success. I think long-term, what I've kind of watching on my radar and I think is going to have a dramatic impact on all of this as we continue to go through is kind of the role of AI in the technology realm of how does that assist with differentiation and assist with students. I know ChatGPT is a big topic amongst my English language arts teachers in the systems. And, fortunately, we're already in the conversation about talking about, well, what does your assessment design look like? How could ChatGPT or artificial intelligence be used to guide a student, scaffold instruction for a student, enhance the product that they're building, rather than, being fearful of it? And to me, it goes back to the age of when the calculator first got introduced, and math teachers all across the country were fearful of what that was going to do and how it was going to ruin mathematics education, but that's not really the case. So we're in an exciting time of where the evolution of technology will go because of AI, and as we think about that within pathway learning for personalization.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.